Description: a glimpse into the breathtaking evolution of cities in the 22nd century. Discover how urban landscapes transformed into vertical ecosystems, blending technology and nature to sustain life in ways we once thought impossible. Chapter 1: The City That Kissed the Clouds. I still remember the first time I saw it, the Skybound arcology rising above the Atlantic like a monumental shard of glass, glistening in the sunlight. It was my first time leaving the comfort of Arca Terra, the underground biome where I was born. "You're not ready for this," my guide, Emira, had teased. She was one of those people who had lived through the mid-century transformations, old enough to remember when cities were still sprawled across miles of land. "Seeing it with your own eyes will change you," she'd said. And she was right. The city was unlike anything I had ever imagined. Buildings were no longer simple structures, they were ecosystems in themselves. Entire forests stretched across their rooftops, their roots winding into soil pods embedded in the architecture. Rivers coursed through skyways, cascading into waterfalls that powered turbines below. Solar panels glittered like scales on the building's surfaces, absorbing every sliver of sunlight. People traveled through translucent tube networks that wove between the buildings, propelled by magnetic levitation and wind currents. "We call them wind rails," Emira explained as we stepped into one. The tube was eerily silent, the city below unfolding like a living tapestry. Skybound wasn't just a city, it was an organism. It breathed, consumed, and recycled every resource it touched. Waste was unheard of here. Bioconversion plants processed everything, turning scraps into fuel, fabrics, or nutrients. I couldn't help but ask, how did all this happen? "Necessity," Emira replied, her tone both somber and proud. "When land ran out and the oceans rose, we had no choice but to build up. What started as desperation became innovation." But even as I marveled, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The streets, or lack thereof, were eerily quiet. There were no open plazas filled with the sounds of life. Everyone seemed confined to their vertical pods, their lives isolated despite their proximity. Chapter 2: A Skybound History. Emira's words stayed with me as I wandered the city's labyrinth of levels. The Skybound arcology had over 100 strata, each dedicated to a specific purpose. The lower levels housed massive hydroponic farms, growing everything from algae to exotic fruits. The middle levels bustled with workspaces, educational hubs, and cultural centers, while the uppermost levels, shielded by smart glass domes, were reserved for recreation and luxury. The story of these vertical cities began in the early 21st century, Emira explained during one of our guided walks. By the mid-2000s, cities had already begun to choke under the weight of overpopulation and climate change. Coastal metropolises were drowning, while inland cities suffocated under heat waves and pollution. The tipping point came in the 2070s, a period historians now call the urban exodus. Traditional cities collapsed under their own weight, Emira continued. Floods claimed New York. Desertification swallowed Cairo. People needed a solution, and fast. The answer had come from an unexpected alliance of architects, environmental scientists, and technologists. Instead of expanding outward, they had asked a radical question: what if cities grew upward instead? It wasn't an easy transition. Early arcologies were plagued with problems: power failures, structural collapses, and the psychological toll of living in confined spaces. They called them hive cities back then, Emira said, shaking her head. And for good reason. People felt like drones, not human beings. But as technology advanced, so did the cities. By the late 21st century, they had perfected the balance. AI-driven systems managed resources with precision. Renewable energy became the norm, and bioengineering turned sterile buildings into lush, self-sustaining habitats. Still, the deeper I ventured into Skybound, the more I began to question the cost of such perfection. People seemed distant, their faces lit not by the sun but by the glow of their personal holoscreens. In one of the recreational domes, I met a group of children playing with a projection of a forest, complete with birdsong and rustling leaves. I asked a boy why he wasn't outside, and he blinked at me, confused. "But this is outside," he said. Chapter 3, Roots of Isolation. The boy's words lingered in my mind as I descended to the mid-levels, where daily life thrived, or at least functioned. Emira guided me through the bustling corridors, their walls lined with interactive displays offering everything from news updates to virtual meditation sessions. People moved quickly, their gazes glued to augmented reality interfaces projected into their vision. It was efficient, yes, but strangely devoid of warmth. "Where do people gather here?" I asked, scanning for signs of community, cafes, plazas, markets. Emira sighed, her gaze flicking to a group of workers walking briskly toward a communal workspace. "Gathering isn't as common as it once was. Social interaction here is purposeful. Meetings, collaborations, even leisure, everything is scheduled." She gestured to a transparent dome overhead, its surface shimmering as a fleet of drones passed by, delivering goods to residential pods. In a city like this, space is a premium. Public squares gave way to efficiency. Most people connect virtually, it's just easier. Her word struck me. In their quest for survival, had humanity traded its soul for progress? The vibrant chaos of old cities, the street musicians, the laughter echoing from open-air cafes, the impromptu conversations with strangers, seemed absent here. We passed a cluster of students engrossed in a holographic lecture. One of them looked up as I walked by, his augmented eyes flickering with recognition. "You're an outsider," he said bluntly. I nodded, and he tilted his head. "What's it like where you're from?" Before I could answer, Emira cut in. "He's from Arca-Terra. It's a different way of living." Her tone had a note of finality, as if discouraging further questions. The student shrugged and returned to his lesson, but his question stayed with me. What was it like where I was from? Chapter 4, A Tale of Two Worlds. Arca-Terra was nothing like Skyhold. While Skyhold reached for the heavens, Arca-Terra burrowed into the earth. My home was one of the first subterranean biospheres, designed for those who rejected the vertical city's sterile, tech-centric lifestyle. We lived in harmony with the natural world, even if it meant existing beneath it. Sunlight was simulated but warm, and our air was sweet with the scent of soil and plants. We farmed by hand, traded goods in person, and celebrated every seasonal shift with festivals. But we also faced limitations. Space was tight, and resources were finite. Growth was carefully controlled, and new technology was often met with skepticism. People joked that we were the Luddites of the 22nd century, clinging to the past while the world above soared into the future. Yet, despite its flaws, there was a richness to our lives that I struggled to find in Skyhold. We knew our neighbors by name. We gathered for meals, sang songs around bonfires, and shared stories that bound us together. As I shared this with Emira later that evening, her expression softened. "It sounds beautiful," she admitted, her gaze distant. "But don't you ever feel confined? Trapped underground?" I considered her question. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But isn't that true for everyone? Whether it's underground or 100 stories in the sky, a city is just a shell. What matters is how we fill it." She fell silent, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her otherwise confident demeanor. Perhaps Skyhold and Arca-Terra were two extremes of the same struggle, humanity's endless quest to build a better world. But as I looked out over the glowing cityscape that night, I wondered if the future lay not in choosing one over the other, but in finding a way to bring them together. Chapter 5, A Fractured Future. The next day, Emira took me to the heart of Skyhold's decision-making center, the Nexus. It was a cavernous chamber nestled in the city's core, where algorithms and human advisors worked together to manage the arcology's delicate equilibrium. The Nexus wasn't what I expected. Instead of bustling with activity, it was eerily quiet. Rows of advisors sat in suspended chairs, their neural interfaces glowing softly as they interacted with the city's AI. Above them, holographic displays mapped every aspect of Skyhold's operation: energy flows, waste processing, population density, weather patterns. "This is where the magic happens," Emira said, gesturing toward the central AI hub, a towering crystal-like structure pulsing with light. "We call it Aurora. It predicts resource needs, optimizes workflows, even mediates disputes." I stared at the shimmering structure, feeling both awe and unease. "So, the city runs itself?" Emira nodded. "Mostly. Humans still make the big decisions, but Aurora handles the rest. It's the only way to keep a place like this running." "And what happens when Aurora fails?" I asked. Her expression darkened. "It doesn't. It can't. That's why it's constantly learning, adapting. Every system has redundancies." But her confidence felt brittle, as if even she didn't entirely believe it. I remembered the stories I'd heard about early arcologies, how power outages or software glitches had led to chaos, even death. Skyhold might be a marvel of engineering, but it was also a delicate balancing act, one that could tip into disaster with the slightest misstep. As we left the Nexus, I couldn't help but wonder, had humanity become too dependent on its creations? In our quest for perfection, had we built cities that were not just smarter, but also more fragile? Chapter 6, Cracks in the Glass. That night, as I wandered one of Skyhold's residential levels, I stumbled upon a scene that made my heart ache. A woman sat alone in a glass-walled pod, staring blankly at a holographic projection of a meadow. She reached out as if to touch the flowers, her hand passing through the light. I tapped on the glass, and she started, turning toward me with a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. After a moment, she gestured for me to enter. Her name was Naya, and she was one of Skyhold's original residents. As we talked, she shared her story, how she had once loved the city's promise of a brighter future but had grown disillusioned over the years. "At first, it felt like freedom," she said, her voice heavy with nostalgia. "No pollution, no overcrowding, no crime. But now..." She trailed off, her gaze drifting back to the holographic meadow. "Now it feels like a cage," I finished for her. She nodded. "We've eliminated so many of life's problems, but we've lost its spontaneity. Everything here is so controlled." Her words echoed what I had been feeling since my arrival. Skyhold was a marvel, yes, but it was also a place of profound isolation. People lived stacked atop one another yet seemed more disconnected than ever. "Do you ever think about leaving?" I asked. Naya smiled faintly. "And go where? The outside world isn't much better. Flooded, scorched, poisoned. This city may not be perfect, but it's safe." Safe. The word lingered in the air like a challenge. Was safety enough? Could humanity truly thrive in a world stripped of risk, of unpredictability? As I left Naya's pod and stepped back into the corridor, I felt a growing sense of urgency. The vertical cities of the 22nd century were a triumph of human ingenuity, but they were also a stark reminder of what we had lost in our pursuit of survival. Chapter 7, The Hidden Levels. A few days later, Emira introduced me to an unusual group of residents, those who lived in Skyhold's unofficial levels. These were the forgotten spaces, tucked into the seams of the arcology's grandeur. It began with a cryptic invitation. A woman named Kale intercepted me during a walk through one of Skyhold's atriums. Her manner was brisk, her tone impatient. "You want to see the real city?" she asked, her piercing gaze locking onto mine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed her to a narrow, unmarked lift hidden behind a maintenance hatch. The ride down was long and silent, the polished perfection of Skyhold giving way to rough, unadorned walls. When the doors finally opened, I found myself in a dimly lit space that felt worlds apart from the gleaming levels above. Here, the air was heavy with the scent of machinery and damp earth. Makeshift gardens sprouted from cracks in the floor, and people bustled about, repairing equipment, weaving fabrics, even brewing something that smelled suspiciously like alcohol. "This is the Verge," Kale said, spreading her arms wide. "The part of Skyhold no one talks about." The Verge was a patchwork of old systems and new ideas. Its residents were a mix of rebels, inventors, and outcasts, those who had grown disillusioned with the tightly controlled life above. They had repurposed forgotten technology, creating their own microeconomy and governance. I watched as a young girl adjusted a solar converter, her hands deft and confident. Nearby, an elderly man taught a group of children how to grow mushrooms in recycled soil pods. "Why stay here?" I asked Kale, unable to hide my amazement. "Why not leave the city altogether?" She laughed, a dry, sardonic sound. "And go where? The surface is a wasteland, and Arca-Terra's doors are shut to people like us. Besides, we're not trying to escape. We're trying to fix what's broken." Her words struck a chord. The Verge was chaotic, yes, but it was also alive in a way the upper levels weren't. Here, people weren't just surviving, they were experimenting, creating, finding new ways to live. Chapter 8, Sparks of Resistance. Over the following days, I spent more time in the Verge, learning about its people and their philosophies. They called themselves the Rooted, a nod to their belief that humanity had strayed too far from its origins. Kale explained their vision one evening as we sat around a makeshift fire pit. "The upper city is a masterpiece, no doubt," she admitted, her face lit by the flickering flames. "But it's a hollow one. Aurora controls everything up there, what people eat, how they work, even how they think. Down here, we make our own choices, messy as they are." I nodded, thinking back to Naya's words about safety. Skyhold's perfection came at a cost: freedom, spontaneity, connection. The Rooted were trying to reclaim those things, even if it meant living in the city's forgotten shadows. But their efforts weren't without risk. Emira warned me about Skyhold's security forces, who saw the Verge as a threat to the city's carefully balanced ecosystem. "They won't shut it down outright," she said, her voice low. "But they monitor it closely. Too much disruption, and they'll intervene." The tension was palpable. Every invention, every act of defiance, felt like a gamble. Yet the Rooted pressed on, driven by a shared belief that humanity's future couldn't be built solely on technology and control. One evening, Kale showed me their most ambitious project yet, a prototype for a hybrid system that combined the arcology's advanced tech with traditional, earth-based practices. It was crude, but brilliant, a biodome powered by both solar grids and manual labor, designed to sustain a small, self-sufficient community. "This is our way forward," Kale said, her eyes alight with determination. "Not just for Skyhold, but for every city like it. Balance, not domination. Connection, not isolation." As I stood there, watching the Rooted work, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps they were onto something. Perhaps the answer to humanity's struggles lay not in choosing between the sky and the earth, but in finding a way to bridge the two. Chapter 9, Fault Lines. Despite the Rooted's hopeful vision, tensions between their world and the rest of Skyhold simmered beneath the surface. One afternoon, I returned to the upper levels to find a noticeable shift in the city's atmosphere. Aurora had issued new directives, energy rationing, stricter movement restrictions, and a curfew for certain strata. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. I asked Emira about it during dinner in one of the mid-level cafeterias. "It's nothing to worry about," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Aurora has been detecting anomalies, spikes in energy use, unauthorized modifications to infrastructure. It's just a precaution." I knew better. The anomalies were the rooted's work, their experiments pushing the boundaries of what the city's systems could handle. They had made themselves known, and now Aurora was tightening its grip. Emira must have sensed my unease. "Look," she said, leaning closer. "Skyhold is a system. If one part of that system goes rogue, it affects everyone. The Verge might think they're helping, but they're putting the entire city at risk." I didn't respond. Her words echoed the justification I had heard so often in Skyhold, the belief that order was paramount, even at the expense of individuality. But after spending time with the rooted, I couldn't help but question that logic. Later that night, I returned to the Verge and told Kale about Aurora's new measures. She listened in silence, her expression unreadable. "We knew this would happen eventually," she said finally. "The system was never going to let us exist quietly. But we're not backing down. Not now." Her resolve was admirable, but it was also dangerous. The line between resistance and rebellion was growing thinner by the day, and I feared what might happen if it were crossed. Chapter 10, The Breaking Point. It didn't take long for the conflict to escalate. One morning, a sudden blackout plunged several of Skyhold's middle levels into darkness. Residents panicked, their reliance on the city's automated systems leaving them ill-prepared to cope. Rumors spread quickly, a sabotage attempt by the rooted, retaliation from Aurora, or even a glitch in the system's increasingly strained infrastructure. Whatever the cause, the blackout was a turning point. Skyhold's leaders convened an emergency council, and within hours, security forces began descending into the Verge. I was there when they arrived. Armed with non-lethal weapons and drones, they moved through the tunnels like an unstoppable wave, rounding up anyone who looked like they might be involved in the Rooted's activities. Kale grabbed my arm, pulling me into a hidden alcove. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "They don't know you're one of us." From our hiding spot, we watched as security officers dismantled one of the Rooted's workshops, confiscating tools, data cores, and even the biodome prototype. A young man resisted, shouting about freedom and fairness, but he was quickly subdued. When the officers moved on, Kale emerged from the shadows, her face pale but determined. "This isn't over," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. "They can take our tools, our projects, even our people. But they can't take the idea." Her defiance was inspiring, but I couldn't ignore the cost. The Rooted were fighting for a better future, but their struggle was fracturing the city even further. Skyhold wasn't just a marvel of engineering, it was a fragile ecosystem, and every conflict threatened to tear it apart. As I left the Verge that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the city was hurtling toward a breaking point. The question wasn't whether it would come, but what would be left standing when it did. Chapter 11, Collapse in the Heights. The breaking point came sooner than anyone expected. I was in one of Skyhold's upper recreational domes when the alarms blared, an ear-splitting wail that reverberated through the entire city. The serene artificial sky flickered, replaced by a stark red warning overlay. Messages scrolled across every surface: critical system failure. Evacuate non-essential areas immediately. At first, no one moved. Skyhold had faced minor glitches before, and most residents trusted Aurora to resolve them within minutes. But this was different. The ground trembled faintly beneath my feet, followed by a sudden, deafening silence as the windrail system ground to a halt. I activated the nearest console, hoping for answers, but the screen displayed only fragmented data. Emira's voice came through my communicator, urgent and breathless. "It's the lower levels. Something's gone wrong with the main energy grid. Aurora's trying to stabilize, but it's failing." Her words sent a chill down my spine. If the energy grid collapsed, the entire arcology would fail. Without power, the hydroponic farms would wither, the air filtration systems would stop, and Skyhold's towering structure might become an uninhabitable tomb. I thought of the Verge, its makeshift systems straining against the city's automated infrastructure. Had their experiments triggered this? Or had Aurora's tightening grip pushed Skyhold to the brink? In the chaos, I made my way toward a transport hub, desperate to reach the lower levels. The elevators were offline, so I joined a stream of panicked residents descending the emergency stairwells. As we moved, snippets of conversation filled the air: blame, fear, confusion. "It's the Verge's fault," someone shouted. "No, it's Aurora. It's out of control." The blame game had begun, but neither side seemed to grasp the bigger picture. Skyhold wasn't just a city, it was a delicate experiment, a balancing act between humanity's ingenuity and its hubris. And now that balance was collapsing. Chapter 12, The Choice. By the time I reached the Verge, it was a war zone. Security forces clashed with routed members who had barricaded themselves in one of the larger workshops. Sparks flew as drones cut through metal doors, while protesters threw improvised devices to disable them. Kale spotted me and pulled me into a hidden passageway. Her face was smeared with soot, her eyes blazing with fury and desperation. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though her grip on my arm suggested otherwise. "What's happening?" I demanded. She shook her head. "Aurora's cutting off power to the Verge. They think it'll isolate the problem, but it's making things worse. Without the lower-level grid, the whole city's collapsing." Her words hit me like a blow. Aurora, the system that was supposed to save Skyhold, was inadvertently destroying it. And the rooted, in their quest to reclaim autonomy, had pushed it to the edge. As we reached a control room deep within the Verge, Kale revealed their plan. "We've rigged a bypass system," she explained, pointing to a makeshift console. "It'll redirect power from Aurora's core to stabilize the grid." But what?" Kale hesitated, her voice trembling. "It'll override Aurora completely. The city will lose its automated systems. Everything will have to be managed manually, for better or worse." I understood the gravity of her words. Skyhold's survival depended on its automation. Without Aurora, chaos could spread, but with it, the city's future felt increasingly hollow and controlled. As I stood there, the weight of the decision pressed down on me. Kale turned to me, her expression resolute. "We can't do this alone. If you believe in what we're trying to build, help us." I thought of Emira, of Naya, of the countless faces I'd seen in both the upper levels and the Verge. Skyhold was more than its systems or its architecture, it was its people. And right now, they needed a choice, a chance to reclaim their humanity, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, I stepped toward the console. "Let's do it," I said. Kale nodded, her hand hovering over the activation switch. Together, we initiated the bypass. The room lit up as the system roared to life, redirecting energy to the lower levels. Aurora's holographic presence flickered and dimmed, its control severed. For a moment, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Then the lights returned, dim but steady. Skyhold was alive, but it was no longer the same. Chapter 13, After the silence. As the bypass hummed to life, an eerie calm settled over Skyhold. The alarm ceased, the oppressive red glow of the emergency overlays fading into a muted amber. Kale and I stood in silence, watching the console display a crude but functional readout of the redirected grid. "It worked," she said, though her voice held little triumph. "For now. For now." The words hung in the air, a sobering reminder of what lay ahead. With Aurora offline, the city's intricate systems were vulnerable. Food production, air filtration, transportation, everything would have to be managed manually. I left the verge as the first signs of change rippled through Skyhold. Without Aurora to regulate their movements, people wandered the corridors, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. I saw neighbors helping each other down stairwells, strangers sharing supplies in communal areas that had once been silent. In the upper levels, I found Emira coordinating efforts to stabilize the city. When she saw me, her relief was palpable. "You're alive," she said, pulling me into a brief, fierce embrace. Then her expression hardened. "What happened? Why is Aurora offline?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. The Verge, they had a backup plan. It was the only way to stabilize the grid. Her eyes narrowed. "You mean they shut it down? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before I could respond, a man interrupted, his voice frantic. "We've lost climate control on the uppermost levels. Temperatures are rising, people are panicking." Emira cursed under her breath, already moving to address the crisis. But before she left, she turned to me, her tone sharp. "I hope you know what you're doing." I wasn't sure I did. Chapter 14, The Weight of Freedom. Over the next few days, Skyhold transformed. Without Aurora's guidance, the city's residents were forced to confront the realities of their dependence. Systems failed unpredictably, forcing people to adapt on the fly. Hydroponic farms needed human oversight, wind rails remained offline, replaced by makeshift pedestrian routes. At first, the chaos seemed overwhelming. Arguments erupted in communal areas, and tempers flared as people struggled to navigate their new reality. But amid the turmoil, something unexpected began to happen. People started talking to each other. I saw it in the mid-level atriums, where groups formed to organize food distribution. On the recreational domes, where residents debated how to prioritize limited resources. In the Verge, where Kale and her team shared their knowledge of manual systems with anyone willing to learn. One evening, I returned to Naya's pod. This time, she wasn't staring at a holographic meadow. Instead, she was tending to a small patch of real plants she'd brought down from the upper levels. "It's harder this way," she admitted, wiping dirt from her hands. "But it feels real." Her words echoed what I was seeing throughout Skyhold. The city was no longer perfect, but it was alive in a way it hadn't been before. People were taking ownership of their lives, their struggles forging connections that had long been absent. Still, the challenges were immense. Skyhold's design wasn't meant for manual operation, and the strain was beginning to show. Without a centralized system, disputes over resources threatened to spiral out of control. One night, Kale gathered a group in the Verge to discuss the city's future. "This isn't sustainable," she admitted, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "We've proven we don't need Aurora to survive, but if we want to thrive, we need something better." A heated debate followed. Some argued for restoring parts of Aurora's system, but with stricter human oversight. Others wanted to reinvent the city entirely, decentralizing power to give each strata more autonomy. I listened, realizing that this was the true test of Skyhold's resilience. Not the systems or the architecture, but the people's ability to build something new from the ashes of what had failed. As the meeting ended, Kale turned to me. "You've seen both sides of this city, the heights and the depths. What do you think we should do?" I didn't have an easy answer. But for the first time since arriving in Skyhold, I felt hopeful. The city's future was uncertain, yes, but it was also full of possibility. I think, I said, the only way forward is together. Chapter 15, A Fragile Alliance. Kale's words about unity stayed with me long after the meeting. The next morning, I joined her and a group of Verge leaders as they ventured into the mid-levels to propose a plan for collaboration. The goal was to bridge the divide between the Rooted and Skyhold's officials, a task that seemed almost impossible given the recent chaos. The meeting took place in the Grand Atrium, one of the few spaces large enough to accommodate representatives from every stratum. For the first time, I saw the different worlds of Skyhold gathered in one place. Corporate leaders from the upper levels, engineers from the middle strata, and Verge inhabitants, all under the same dome, yet worlds apart. Emira sat across from Kale at the circular table. The tension between them was palpable. "You've made your point," Emira began, her tone clipped. "Skyhold systems are fragile, and Aurora isn't infallible. But this city wasn't built to run on improvisation. We need order." Kale leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. "Order doesn't mean control. What we've proven is that people are capable of more than you give them credit for. Trust them, and they'll rise to the occasion." The debate was heated, each side clinging to their vision of the city's future. At one point, a young technician from the mid-levels stood up, her voice trembling with frustration. "This isn't about sides," she said. "We're all part of this city. If we don't work together, it won't matter whose plan is better, Skyhold will fail." Her words silenced the room. Slowly, the conversation began to shift. Ideas were exchanged, compromises proposed. The Rooted offered to share their knowledge of decentralized systems, while Emira's team suggested restoring parts of Aurora to handle critical functions like climate control and air filtration. By the end of the meeting, a tentative plan had emerged, a hybrid model that combined human oversight with limited automation. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As the room emptied, I caught Emira and Kale speaking quietly. There was still tension between them, but also a newfound respect. "This doesn't mean I trust you," Emira said, her arms crossed. "And I'm not asking you to," Kale replied. "I'm asking you to trust the people." Chapter 16, Rebuilding Together. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest, and most inspiring, of my life. Skyhold's residents faced a steep learning curve as they adjusted to their new reality. But for the first time, the city felt truly alive. I watched as the upper levels organized food-sharing programs with the hydroponic farms in the middle strata. Engineers from the Verge collaborated with mid-level technicians to repair failing systems. Artists painted murals in once sterile corridors, turning them into vibrant spaces that reflected the city's newfound spirit. One day, I found Emira and Kale standing together in what had once been a lifeless skybridge. Now, it was a thriving community garden, tended by residents from all levels of the city. "It's not what I expected," Emira admitted, watching as a group of children planted herbs in repurposed soil pods. "But maybe that's a good thing." Kale smiled faintly. "It's a start." Skyhold was far from perfect. Disputes still arose, and the city's infrastructure remained fragile. But its people had rediscovered something far more important than efficiency or perfection, the power of connection, collaboration, and hope. As I prepared to leave the city, Emira and Kale joined me at the transport hub. "You're really going back to Arca Terra?" Emira asked, her tone half curious, half teasing. I nodded. "I need to tell them what I've seen here. They need to know it's possible to build something different." Kale extended a hand, her grip firm. "Tell them this isn't just Skyhold's story. It's humanity's. If we can find a way to thrive here, so can they." As the transport lifted off, carrying me away from the gleaming towers and shadowed depths of Skyhold, I felt a surge of optimism. The city wasn't just a marvel of architecture or technology. It was a testament to humanity's resilience, its ability to adapt, to fall, and to rise again. Skyhold's future was uncertain, but it was also full of potential. And for the first time, I believed that its people would find a way forward, together.